Thank you for listening to the Calgary Business Podcast. As host, I continue to learn about the initiatives from small business owners, students, student founders, educators, edtech founders, civic officials, nonprofit executives, healthcare executives, technology experts, technology startup founders, and even oil and gas tech startups. These individuals have shared their stories in person during the pre-COVID period and remotely throughout the COVID and the quasi-COVID opening periods. Out of 86 podcasts recorded and released so far in 2021, I had the privilege of learning about the important support network of Woods Homes from clinical coordinator David Williamson during episode 309. As I learned, Woods Homes provides treatment and support for children, youth, and families with mental health needs, a service that has become increasingly important during the COVID pandemic. Take the time to consider learning more about and possibly donating to Woods Homes and their many programs, including the Elbow Springs Counseling Service. Once again, thanks for listening to the Calgary Business Podcast. I invite you to subscribe to the podcast from whatever app you access your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and even Amazon Music. I also invite you to leave a review. This will allow others to easily find the Calgary Business Podcast. Have a great day and stay safe. Good afternoon and welcome to Calgary Business Podcast. I'm your host, Alan Wozni, and for episode number 316, I've got Dr. Nicole Byers on the line.
Hi, Alan. Thanks for having me.
So we've already established I can call you Nicole,
yes,
but from time to time I might call you Doctor if I need some assistance.
Okay, sounds good.
But you've started a clinic called Rocky Mountain Neurosciences. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes.
That's a mouthful, and for the two listeners out there, just beware. We'll shorten it somehow, but haven't figured that out yet. But Nicole, please let's start. What got you started? You background information. Introduce yourself, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess it kind of goes back a ways back to my early days in university when I went to school having no idea what I wanted to do with my life, and kind of by happenstance, I registered for this class called Introduction to Neuropsychology, which I had never heard of before. Yeah. And thankfully, I had an amazing professor for this class. And what she would do each lesson is she would come in and tell a new case study or story about basically all the ways things can go wrong in our brain in terms of our thinking skills, like our memory and concentration. And it was amazing. These were amazing case studies and amazing stories. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I can't believe our brains are so incredible. I have to find out more about this weird thing called neuropsychology. So I followed her around for a couple of years, basically, as an undergraduate student. Kind of, yeah. This was years ago, so I couldn't stalk her online. So I just stalked her in person and volunteered in her lab.
Much scarier.
Yeah, probably. Right. Yeah. So I talked her into letting me join her lab and help out as an assistant, as a student, and volunteer. And eventually convinced her to take me on as a graduate student a few years later. And so I went to graduate school for a really long time. And my background's in clinical psychology, but I specialize in, like I said, what's called neuropsychology, which is basically psychologists who study brain health, things that can impact the health of your brain, like illnesses or injuries, and kind of what really holds us back from being successful day to day.
Well, I guess that mind map. There's the one thing. There's mind mapping. I had this conversation the other day regarding a journalist. It was a few years ago. It's called Moonwalking with Einstein.
Okay.
He wrote the book, and he literally did the whole mind. So talking about the mind, and he's like, he started just who's the mind, the memory, the guys who are the memory people. And I know this isn't neuroscience, but it was that whole memory, mind mapping, and using your memory or using your mind to memorize things. And he remembered. So because of his research, he ended up being the memory champion of 2000, whatever it was, whenever he wrote this book.
Interesting.
Yeah. He spent a year as a journalist. He goes, I can do that. And it's fascinating. So, I mean, the mind is full of mysterious things. So, but a clinical psychologist, so the difference is you help people with their mind challenges
whereas a neuroscientist or neuropsychologist, you studied. Maybe you can clarify that.
Sure. Yeah, good question. So clinical psychologists can work in lots of different types of settings. So there are clinical psychologists who work in hospitals, they work in traditional mental health settings with people who struggle with things like anxiety, depression, all the way up to severe mental illness like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. There are also clinical psychologists who work as part of the more health focused side of the hospital setting, working with people who struggle with pain, for example, or who have illnesses like diabetes and struggle with managing that illness and all of the stress and anxiety that can come from living with a chronic illness. There are even clinical psychologists who work in the school system with kids and youth and teachers, and there are clinical psychologists who work in business, helping teams. And so there are tons of areas that we can work in. And neuropsychologists, most neuropsychologists tend to work on hospital neuroscience teams. So in clinics where people have had either an injury to their brain, like a brain injury or a stroke, or they have some type of neurological condition like dementia, Alzheimer's disease, that's impacting how they're doing day to day. And they work as part of those teams to help support those individuals and their families, help them figure out kind of where their difficulties are, how we can accommodate and make things a bit easier for them day to day, and also supporting the team and the other care providers, our physicians and nurses.
The bandwidth. I mean, you went from one spectrum, the child or whatever, right through to someone who's injured. Wow. I mean, it's huge. So let's go back to that classroom. You took the class. Do you remember the case study? Do you remember This is Dr. Goldbyer's 101, right? Because your first thing. What was it? What was the study? Do you remember?
I do actually. So the one that has always stuck with me, and I love sharing this story because it has a Canadian connection as well. Famous Canadian neuropsychologist. Her name's Dr. Brenda Milner, who was involved in this study. So it's a case study of this man. We used to refer to him as patient HM. He passed away a few years ago, so we know his name is Henry Malazon now. And Henry, back in the 1950s, he had very severe epilepsy. So really bad seizures that they could not figure out how to control. He was having seizures all the time. It was putting him, at real risk because he was falling and hurting himself and getting himself into lots of potential dangerous situations. So his treatment team decided they were going to do this new procedure that they hadn't done before, where they were going to take out part of his brain called the temporal lobe. And they took out the temporal lobe from both sides of his brain. So your temporal lobe is just like it sounds, kind of right around your temples. What they didn't know at the time was how important this part of the brain, and especially part of it called the hippocampus, is for our memory. So the surgery worked really well in terms of Henry's seizures. He wasn't having seizures anymore. But after the surgery, he was not able to form new memories anymore. So he always thought it was 1955 before his surgery. He met Dr. Brenda Milner, who worked with him for over 30 years. Every time he would meet her, he would reintroduce himself because he never remembered having met her before. And if you've ever seen that Adam Sandler movie, 50 First Dates.
50 first dates. Yeah.
Yes. Right. Yes. Just like that. Just like 10-second Tom from that movie, right? You turn around, he's distracted, he forgets who you are, and he'd reintroduce himself again. And what was really interesting about this work and the work that Dr. Milner did is that even though Henry never remembered meeting her, some of the tasks that she would get him to do, he actually got better over time. And so what this taught us about our brains is that, one, these temporal lobes are so important for our memory, but memory isn't one thing. There are different parts of our brain that are involved in different parts of memory. And so we can learn things without even being aware that we're learning them. He never remembered doing these tasks, but he got better, right? Super interesting. I love that story. And like I said, I love it as well because there's very famous Canadian neuropsychologist involved, Dr. Milner, who actually is still on faculty at McGill, I believe. And she's like 102 or 103 or something and still does research. So she in herself is amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's incredible. So your professor at U of S, it was you went to University of Saskatchewan,
right? Yes.
And so was it she or he?
Yes.
So she was talking about this case, and like you got, I mean, it's fascinating. So the study of the brain, and that then goes to the next point. There's other aspects of the brain that are untapped, and I guess that's your job as a neuropsychologist to tap into those other aspects, or?
Yeah, and to kind of learn more about where our brains are working, where they aren't. So kind of more traditionally, neuropsychologists, before we had fancy neuroimaging equipment like CTs and MRIs,
Sure.
neuropsychologists often worked to help find out kind of where things were going wrong in the brain. So someone would come in with a seizure disorder like Henry, or they've had a stroke, and the tests that neuropsychologists do were designed to help find out where in the brain that problem was, because certain parts of our brain are involved in certain skills. Now we can do this a lot more quickly with imaging, but neuropsychologists are still really involved in a lot of treatment planning and even planning for surgeries with, don't cut into this part because it's important. Here's a part that's not working well. It's okay to cut out, sort of thing.
Well, it's like, okay, the movies are one thing where there are shows, Grey's Anatomy, whatever it is, where they keep the patient awake.
Mm-hmm.
Is that real life as well when they do brain surgery? Just
Yes.
curious, for my own curiosity.
Yes. Yeah. So fast forward a few years from when I was in university, when I was doing my residency in Halifax many years ago, I got to watch a few neurosurgeries doing just what you're describing, which were also incredible to get to watch. So one of them, just like you said, is that often when surgeons are cutting into the brain, they want to make sure they're not hitting areas that are really important for your functioning, right? Especially your language skills. We really don't want to mess with language. It's so important being able to speak and communicate. And so what neuropsychologists will do is they will come into the surgical room with the neurosurgeon, and the neurosurgeon will be, someone's head's open, patient is awake on the table, which is incredible on its own. And then they'll stimulate parts of the brain, and then we will do tests with them to make sure that they're not having trouble speaking or remembering. And if everything is okay, then they know they can cut that part out. So yes, actually, just like in the movies, often people are awake when they're having these surgeries, which is really interesting.
I really just don't know where to go with it right now. I'm wowed. I'm sorry. Can I just absorb some of it? But it's incredible. Like, I can see your fascination as a student. So the research took you did a little time with Alberta Services, and were you working in this field during your time with Alberta Health Services?
Yeah. So after I graduated, finished my residency, I'm from Alberta originally. So we were fortunate enough that I was coming back to Alberta right when the new South Health Campus Hospital was opening in Calgary. So I got a job in the hospital working on the neuroscience team there. And I worked there for, a few years doing just exactly what I've been trained to do, right? Working with teams, working with people with illnesses, working on different neurology units, and was able to really learn a lot during that time.
That's fascinating. There's the expression, it's not a rocket science or not a neuroscience. And you're like, hey, I am. I don't
right.
Do you get people that say that except for you? That's incredible. Like you're in that field. It's kind of like one of those disciplines that people talk about, but they never do it. And here I am talking to a it's incredible. Sorry, I'm really just, I'm in the clouds.
Thank you.
My head's in the clouds. But when you opened your own practice, is it now, do you have equipment? Because you're using, let's go to the tech side. And I don't mean tech as in CT scans,
kind of what's
but like
involved.
equipment.
Yeah. That's a great question. So I worked in the hospital, like I said, for a number of years, and then I really enjoyed it. I had a really great team. I liked the patients and families that I was working with. I loved where I was working, but I found after a few years, I kind of reached the limit of where I could progress in public health. I'm not sure if you're, really familiar with how that works, but there's kind of a ceiling, right? You kind of get that dream job, and there's not a lot that you can do after that. Not a lot of room for progression. And I got a little bit bored and a little bit restless with what I was doing. And even though I love my job, I wanted a new challenge. And so I shifted to starting my own private practice, where part of the work that I do is very similar to what I was doing in the hospital, where I'm doing neuropsychology assessments. A lot of the clients that I see in the community come in through insurance companies or WCB. So they've had injuries at work where they've had injury to their head, or lots of people who've been in car accidents and are struggling with memory and concentration. And so, my role is, just like you said, we have they're not super fancy tools when you look at them, but a number of tasks that are designed to evaluate these different abilities. So they're tasks that are designed to evaluate how well can you learn, how well can you remember, how well can you focus, can you come up with the words that you need to be able to do, can you solve problems, can you think critically, all of these different skills and tasks that we use to determine kind of where these folks are struggling, where can we direct them in terms of supports that they might need, day-to-day kind of modifications, whether it's at school or at work, or kind of how can we get them back to living as much of their life as we can.
if I didn't know you were a neuropsychologist or neuroscience, I would have thought what you just said would fit very well into, say, 2014, 15, 16, when a lot of people lost their jobs, and your analysis of what can you do, where's your, you know what I mean? Like a lot of what you just said, take out the neuroscience, could fit really well into understanding what interests people, where they could go and work, other disciplines outside oil and gas. I don't know what you think, but I sort of heard that you could probably help people in other ways as well. I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. And there are psychologists that do work in that area with kind of vocational counseling and planning. And like you said, to help determine, not just in terms of what our thinking skills are that are strengths, but also in terms of our, personal strengths, our personality, our style, our kind of coping strengths and weaknesses, and how that can kind of lead to, success in certain areas versus other areas with work. There are definitely lots of psychologists who work, like I said, with businesses and corporations and schools to help with some of that team planning and employment.
I guess that's that is it called Briggs and Stratton or whatever that Briggs and Myers, Bristol Myers?
Oh yes, Myers-Briggs. Yep, you got it.
It's not Bristol Myers, and Briggs and Stratton's another thing.
Yeah.
Okay, but there's psychologists clinical psychologists that would do that kind of the commercial side, the business side.
Yeah.
Now I just had to share the shout out to from that clinical, because you did work in clinical psychology for a while. It looks like, or that's your PhD in that, right? Or
correct.
Because I had David Williamson on. He's over at he was at a different university, but he Woods Homes. But he went up the track of working in the community, and now Woods Homes is working with at-risk youths and family. And it's that level. It's the mental health kind of side, but people that are struggling in inner city or wherever they are. So that was episode 309, and then one other one, and Pierre Widgeness. I don't know if you know Pierre and the newer Aura team.
I don't know.
So and he touches on the newer Aura focuses on epilepsy surgery and the brain monitoring side. So I don't know if he's got a PhD in neuroengineering, which is a little different.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was last year, episode 193. So I just was trying to rack my brain. Who are the brain type? There was a third one. It was Daniel Delgado. And they work on it. He was on Alzheimer's, and that's focused on brain mechanics. It's called Brain Mechanics Foundation. So you are the fourth in the brain, if I call it brain, one of those brain surgeons.
Yeah.
So anyway, so thank you for because you're rounding that out, because now you're in a different field, because you work, but your clinic is where, in South Calgary somewhere?
Yes. Yeah. My clinic is here in Quarry Park, actually, in South Calgary.
Okay, so is it McLeod Trail? I head down south, and then I turn left or right.
Really, really far south. Head down Deerfoot, and then you head east at like Douglas Dale. So pretty far south before you get to the hospital, but still pretty south. Yeah.
Oh wait, so you're over southeasty?
Yes.
Ogden, north or whatever. Okay, I didn't know
there's
a hospital down there. I didn't know that. Okay, Douglas Dale. I think you and I had this offline discussion. I was okay. So, but the people drive to you. Obviously, you get referrals. How does that work? I mean, because it's not like people just walk, oh, there's a clinic. I need some brain, I need some help.
That's right. Yeah. Most folks aren't walking off the street. That's for sure. Yeah. Yes. So most of my referrals come from insurance companies. Like I mentioned, WCB, a few from primary healthcare providers as well, other neurologists in the city, for example, where sometimes folks have, because there are also neuropsychologists, like I mentioned, who work in public health, but unfortunately, because of public health system waits, sometimes it's quite long to get into.
So they might refer, go talk to Dr. Nicole, go talk to Dr. Byers. Is that? Get a referral
exactly.
From them? Okay.
Exactly. If there's, if they have insurance coverage, then they go through a little bit faster through the private clinics sometimes.
Okay. I'm going to put the business hat on. Okay. When you made the leap, and you open, like there's that kind of thing, painting the walls, open your office, and like you didn't hang a shingle. Yeah. Were you working from home a little bit and kind of, you know what I mean? Like that transition, or was it just for the business side? I'm curious.
Yeah.
Did you open up
really gradual is how I did it. So what I did was I thankfully have a few great mentors in the city who already had set up shop and have been around for a number of years, and kind of reached out to them and said, where do I start? basically with this. And they gave me some really good tips on, how to find, losing my voice here, how to find leads and how to reach out to the insurance companies and how to get on their list of, they have lists of approved assessors, approved care providers. And then, I really started with the bare minimum. I had basically a rolly suitcase that I lugged around with me. And I got an office that was just a drop down space that I could book, a few days a month to come in and see clients, and then did the rest from home. Right. Until, we built things up over a couple of years to where I had enough that I could, leave my job in the hospital, be here full time, and then kind of slowly building since then. So it was nice that we could have a really small and slow start, which means not a lot of startup costs. And I could really kind of ease into things.
Because you're talking, if you're like WCB or insurance companies, those industries are like, they're dinosaurs in terms of social media. And you mentioned earlier, in the days, there wasn't an internet or whatever. And, like finding like the accountants, the count in me, my colleagues, accounting colleagues, are so old school, and a lot of the insurance people as well. So, I mean, does social media come into play? I'm going to go there, but this is just the one. You just made me think of that. Does social media help you in your business?
On part of my business. So I know I talked a lot about the assessment side of my business. And the other thing that I do, the other part of my business is I do some online coaching and I run online courses really focused on productivity, time management, kind of how to use those neuroscience-based strategies to organize your day for success, get more done in the day, and get rid of some of that overwhelm, for mostly aimed at professional individuals who are kind of running their own businesses and are struggling to juggle all the hats all the time. So for that part of my business, I do have, a website, I have social media accounts, I have a podcast of my own as well. I do all those things, but you're right. For the assessment business, it's a lot of word of mouth, kind of getting to know the right people. I do a lot of presentations as well, a little bit different the last year and a half. I've gotten pretty good at various web platforms for presentations.
Like the Zoom.
Exactly. The Zooms and other things, Microsoft Teams, and presenting for the insurance groups. So I can, get in front of them, teach them a little something about the brain and things that might be helpful for them working with their clients. And then usually that is also a great way to meet those people and get those contacts, so that when, something comes across their desk, they think, oh, maybe Nicole would be a good person to reach out to for some support.
So what triggered that? Like that? Oh, that's just like you're like a Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde. You know what I mean? Like Dr. Byers, Mrs. Hyde. No, but literally, it's like two sides of the coin, because there's that sort of front facing now. There's that out in the media, public facing. What triggered that? Is there some story behind that?
Yeah, that was a gradual build over time. And I think it's something I started getting an interest in when I was in the hospital. I've always loved teaching. Apparently my mom, I don't remember saying this, my mom jokes that when I was little, I said I wanted to be a professor so that I could stay in school forever. And I did stay in school for a very, very, very long time.
Professional student.
Yes, professional student for a long time, but I have always loved teaching. And so when I was in the hospital, I loved doing presentations. I love public speaking. I love being able to meet other people and kind of share, all these things that I find so interesting. And so that's something that I've always wanted to be involved in more. And then actually with, COVID, the past year and a half is something that I had kind of fortunate or unfortunately the chance to spend some more time on when, we weren't able to see people face to face as often. And we had to shift business models a little bit. And so moving more into the online education and delivering workshops online, that's something that, gave me an opportunity to get into that world.
Well, just speaking of sort of online or social media, one thing I learned is most social media platforms, doesn't matter what you're talking about, is either educating or entertaining, right? Those are the two fundamental, and you hit one really important, the fundamental side is that educating. And so where do you throw it on Facebook, or, because I got to tell you, your LinkedIn it's very, very minimal.
It's poor. Yeah, it is. So yes, I do not use LinkedIn a lot. It's not a good place to find me. I do most of my work for social media on Instagram and Facebook are the two platforms that I use most. Just tends to be for that part of my business where I'm trying to reach out to, busy professionals who are feeling overwhelmed and overworked and, work on productivity and time management. That tends to be where I find them right now. Also, it was really honestly a strategic part for me because I didn't have time to figure out how everything worked, right? Like each social media is its own monster of learning. And I've never really used social media a lot on my own before the past few years. And so for my own learning curve, I was like, okay, these are the ones I'm going to dedicate myself to and figure out how they work.
Instagram, I tell you, people say it's not for me, and I'm like, it isn't until you really dig down. If you look, I'm just going to give you, if there's the hashtags of this, you'll find it's incredible what you find.
Mm-hmm.
And since I've been on Instagram, was it like 3 years? It's changed. It's morphed into this more business. I said that I find more people on there on business side than I do, but then I go to the other platforms, they're not there, and I sometimes I'm shocked, particularly when people say I'm not on LinkedIn, not you, and we can talk about you, but when I look at LinkedIn, it's like, for instance, a car dealership or a car, when people working as a salesperson in the car dealership, it said probably 90% or more of the people on LinkedIn own a vehicle. So if you're not on there, you're probably missing out how to, the individuals, like the businesses are there, but so you run a podcast. I'm sorry, this is a podcast. Really? How many episodes? When did you start that?
Yeah. So that was my COVID quarantine project last year in kind of April, May-ish of last year. Psychology has been really fortunate throughout all the pandemic is that we're considered an essential service. So I never had to officially close my doors, but the type of psychology I do isn't really urgent. Like I said, it's lots of disability assessments and, long-term cases. And so, basically for 6 weeks, I had no work in the spring of last year and said, well, what am I going to do with my time? And, how am I going to pivot this business and try to reach a broader audience and expand my business into other income streams? And so I'd, been thinking about starting a podcast or something like a video blog for a while. And I was like, I don't know how I feel about video. So I was like, podcasting, it is, right? So I started my podcast. It's called The Bold Life, focusing on really mindset for success and how our limiting beliefs that we have about ourselves, about the world, can really hold us back with things like self-doubt, with procrastination, how that makes us less productive, which sends us into this spiral of, really not reaching our greatest potential. And what strategies can we use to kind of take back that control and reach our greatest selves?
But this goes almost back to your earlier pre kind of neuropsychology, and there's more your clinical stuff where that self awareness, self-doubt, all that comes into play. How many episodes have you run?
Yes. That is a good question. I want to say 70, 72. I think we're on 72.
That's a lot in a year's time. So hats off to you. So I'm going to look that up. And the posting, see, that's where social media comes into play, because if you find the people to cross post that, the relevancy, and to find, I don't know what you've done on that side, but that, that comes to play. I like, if you've done a YouTube thing and get people on there talking, I guess, are you yourself talking, or do you get people on there with you talking about their issues?
A little bit both. Yeah. So some episodes are just me offering strategies and talking about, different areas that we hold ourselves back. And then others are, bringing guests on who might have expertise in a certain area, or a lot of, sharing experiences. And what I really wanted to do, especially with the guests that I bring on, is, share how we all go through struggles and we all go through tough times. And what are some of those kind of resilient skills? And what are some of those things that help us persevere when times get tough?
Okay. So I'm going to go back to Henry. What was one story you could share from your podcast that you sort of said, this would help the two listeners of my Calgary Business Podcast? Because there's people, what you just said there resonates. I know a lot of people have a similar feel. I don't know what to do and how to do it. So can you share a story? One thing.
Sure.
Nicole?
Yeah. One of my favorite interviews that I've done recently was with a young woman. Her name is Laura Ladd, and she runs a home cleaning company in the United States, in Portland, actually. And what I love about her story is she graduated from university. I can't remember offhand what her degree is actually in, right at the start of the recession back in 2008. And got a job for like 5 minutes and then lost her job, had to move back home with her parents, wasn't feeling very awesome about herself, got a job doing house cleaning because that's all she could find at the time. And she I really love her story because she shares about how that was a hard kind of mental shift, right? To go from, I'm in university, I have all my life ahead of me too. I'm moving back home. I'm taking this job I never really wanted. And then how she actually found something that she loved to do in helping, people clean their homes and developing a team that also loves to do this, and how she grew her business and all the employees that work for her now. And it's just a really great story of, taking what life throws at you, finding that place where you can, keep moving forward and keep trying, even when things are tough and you feel like at your lowest point.
No, I love that. I mean, because she had to be, first of all, as you said, university degree, and that was a humbling experience to go home, no job, as you said, worked for 5. I get it, right? And so that humbling experience made wherever she is today, the success and the impact she's had on her employees and other business owners. There was you remind me of the guest I had, Judy Varag. Sure, if I'm getting the name wrong, but she's got the cleaning company here in Calgary, clean. I can't remember the name of it. But anyway, she posted on LinkedIn. She got the award for some people were giving her awards or something like that. I said, yeah, because in the podcast she mentioned, I no longer take the broom. I still cannot forget that expression. I said, yes, yeah. You no longer take the broom, but now you're taking the awards, because she's posting that, and it's clean. It's Clean Cup Calgary, and it's she was on the podcast. She goes, yeah, I use Jobber. And Jobber, I don't know if you know Jobber, but it's a lot of small businesses use it, and they're out of Edmonton. And when she mentioned it, I'm like, whoa, they had just raised a fair bit of money for that kind of service. The small business owner, the people doing landscaping, the house cleaners, the repair people, individuals that, and so the business, there's companies that have come to the forefront, like your guest, like really just making things happen out of nothing.
Yep.
So let's go to your business, because there's a couple of things I said. So COVID, you mentioned COVID, and your clients, you said there's a transition period there, 6-7 weeks, where you just weren't really getting much, but were clients coming to you then? Well, I need some help. And what did you do on that kind of COVID thing? You said you were doing Zoom calls for your education side, but did you do it for the main business as well?
No, I didn't. So I made the decision early on, just because of how the testing that we do works. Is, like I said, there are lots of tasks that require using different objects, for example. So they don't work great virtually. And I've done a little bit of telehealth in the past. Like you mentioned, I went to graduate school in Saskatoon, and we did a lot of rural outreach via telehealth through the neurology clinics. And so I'd done kind of some brief assessments via telehealth before, people who lived in remote regions, couldn't get into the city to the hospital, but really brief and really not the type of assessments that I was doing now. And the other part of the assessments that I'm doing now is that, unfortunately, one of the things that comes up in insurance cases and, medical legal work are issues of, is the testing valid or not, right? And the tests that we do weren't designed to be administered via telehealth. A year and a half ago, we didn't have a lot of research on how this works. So is it the same? Are we assessing the same skills when we do this electronically or virtually versus someone doing it in person? We didn't have a lot of that information. So I said, no, I don't want to do any of this virtually. We will just wait until kind of we figure out how to do this in person again, how, we set up, sanitation protocols, and we use masks, and we have barriers up in place now. And we did figure this out, but you're right. For a long time, 6 weeks, we just basically shut down. Everyone said, we don't really know what's happening. We don't want to send anyone anywhere unless we have to, kind of non-essential. We're not doing this. So we didn't have any clients. And then even for the next several months, things were really hit and miss in that aspect of my business. Is, we'd get a little bit more knowledge about COVID, and things would lighten up a little bit, and we'd see some more clients, and then there'd be another surge and everything would shut down again. And so it was really inconsistent for a long time. And I'd say still there are some up and downs, right? And we're still struggling with ongoing restrictions and going forward and backward, and kind of what's priority in terms of healthcare right now. And so, that part, I didn't really have it as a steady source of income anymore. Thankfully, I'm a workaholic. And so in the year and a half before that, I worked a lot, probably more than I really needed to work. But that meant that I had this buffer saved in my business financially. So I could take some of that savings and put it towards these new ventures, to learning how to offer online courses, to moving more into the online space and be able to do that.
Well, I think, again, your business, and I'm thinking one discussion I had is because of COVID, the lawyer, because we were talking about signatures with the lawyers, one of the lawyers I had on the podcast, and I can't remember who said it, but I'll just say he said it, that the judges accepted affidavits on the Zoom, sworn that this is a person with a passport and all that, and they were kind of, they were accepting this remote thing because they just physically everything was shut down, but businesses, those kind of things had to continue. So it took them to come a long way. You mentioned validate. Was it valid, or does it prove? Well, I don't know the words you use, but I'm thinking, imagine if you trained a house guest or a house, someone, let's say the parent or a brother or sister or sibling, whoever it is, who's in the home. Could you virtually, not train, but virtually explain, okay, so this is the test, the cognitive test, and you're on a Zoom thing and you're recording it, right? So it's all verifiable. I just, how could you bridge that gap if there was another prolonged period where you couldn't see those people physically, or, for whatever reason? I'm just thinking out loud here, because I think,
great question.
Go ahead.
There has been some work on that, especially for American colleagues. There's much more of them, obviously, than there are for us in Canada. So they have some more resources to put into this, but looking at how can we transition to, we have secure platforms now to use to have medical calls. How can we transition some of this stuff to even an online point and click thing where no one even has to be in the room because they're just pointing and clicking. And there is a bit more of that. Again, I think it's been hard through this whole process because there's just been so much uncertainty with how long it's going to last. So do we put the resources into figuring out how to do this stuff when we don't really know how long it's going to last? Or is this the sign that really, and this is what I took out of this, is that I need to have multiple income streams in my business and multiple ways that I can pivot. And maybe I can't change this one part, but I can start these other projects and other sources to reach clients.
Yeah, but that goes back to, I know maybe that's your own thinking, entrepreneurial thinking, but that range, that early range we talked about earlier, you mentioned where the brain and sort of the things where people need help, and you're kind of trained for that. You have your tool. It's like, I was laughing the other day at people carrying around the tool shed, and the husband's carrying around the joystick in case the kids want to play gaming, right? Where he's got the tool to help fix the IKEA furniture, but at the same time he's got the Game Boy. But I mean, you've got your tools are of the trade, as it were. You can help that child who's just suffering, or the individual who's job loss, or perhaps, that you've got your tool set, the tools in your pram or whatever, the toys in the pram. You've got a lot to play with.
Yeah, I think that's been a good learning experience for me too, throughout all of this of the past few years is, I went to school, and my idea that I had in my head is when I graduate, I'm going to get a job in a hospital and I'm going to stay there until I'm 70 or 80 or whatever and retire. And maybe I'll teach for a little bit. And that was kind of the idea I had, right? This is what a psychologist does. And so part of transitioning to opening my own business, and now more transitions with global pandemic, has been, like you said, is really being more aware of actually how many tools I do have in the tool belt. And we don't have to do things the way that we've always done them just because that's how we've always done them.
Yeah. No, this is fantastic. So we talked about that. In terms of the research, like, because I know you're still doing a little bit of research, or you're doing some work at University of Calgary. Do you find technology? Now I'm talking technology, some that's out there. Are you finding that's helping in data collect, anything? I mean, maybe you want to share your side on the tech, how it either helps your business or it helps the research you're doing.
Unfortunately, I'm not involved in as much research as I was when I was in the hospital, just not quite as much direct contact with those folks, which is too bad. But yes, is my short answer. Things have definitely changed. So for example, my supervisor that I was telling you about at the beginning, I remember we had to move her office one time, and she had this closet that was full of printouts. Remember when we used to have those printers that had the they were like perforated on the edges, like the pages all folded together, right? Like
Yeah.
those
Oh
old
yeah.
ones. Yeah.
Yeah.
So she had stacks
Whoa,
and
I'm
stacks
old.
of
And
data.
you remember that? Those are those the dot matrix ones, and you go to
Yes.
computer science. Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah.
Yes. Those old ones. So she had these stacks of data from when she did her dissertation,
Wow.
20 years prior. And she was so hesitant to give them up because she would tell these stories about how when she was running her dissertation analysis, she had to hire a computer science student to do all this programming. And it would take like 48 hours to run kind of one equation, which I can now do with a click of the button instantly, right? There are so many advanced statistics and analysis programs now that it is so much faster. And what the average person can do is so much greater because of this. I don't need to hire a computer science pro to run some basic analysis. If I have, a couple of groups of patients and I want to compare some of their data, I can do that myself on my home computer, which is, even in my lifetime, that's remarkable. I remember even when I was in university, remember going to the library and having to photocopy journals. Like you'd find the journal on the shelf, right? And bring it to the photocopy room and copy the article. Whereas now I can bring it up instantly on my computer. So just so much more information, and the speed of which it's available has definitely changed our access to research.
It just reminds me, there was a company I came across, they raised $100 million. I don't know the round. And because I tend to troll, we talk about trolling. I tend to troll the venture capital funding, the private funding in the life sciences space. So Health Verity, the VERITY, raised 100 million, and they simply give data to biopharma, pharma, big pharma, whoever it is, to help them do their job. So if they don't have I have no idea. I can imagine they just troll whatever's in the public or whatever information is available on statistics. To your point about, you can just roll this out an analysis within minutes versus, and these guys, and to raise that kind of money, they've certainly got attention of somebody. They must be doing something right. But they're just taking data. I read this just says we're giving data, the tools right to the, the people on the front line kind of thing. And I'm like, that's the way the world is today. People are making it better for people like you. So, I mean, the tools are out there. And I mentioned going back to your, the online or whatever, the Zoom experience.
Yeah.
There's so many tools now that just make that better. Like there's a company called Hopin, and I attended a conference a few weeks ago, and it was an online Zoom thing, but it just felt like they had this massive production, and they go, yeah, this is Hopin, and there was just two people, right? And they interviewed the people from Platform Calgary. They had some people in Vancouver, and it was like, so we're going live. It was as if they're doing one of those, movie productions or whatever, a TV thing or a media thing or whatever it is, CFCN or whatever. You're like, wow. And there's just two people.
Yeah.
They moved around, they zoomed around. It was really fun. It was fun to watch. So I'm saying, I think the tools are getting better to support you, not the, you as in your basic core, how to evaluate the patient. It's helping that experience, making that better. So I think there's probably things out there and they'll come together. You and the techie will come together at some point.
Yeah.
So how does, on your business, does technology help the business side and maybe front office, back office, anything that you want to share?
Yeah, for sure. That's what I was thinking while you were talking as well, is that the advances in technology, even over the past 5 years, how much easier that's made it for me as a small business owner. I run online courses, and there are platforms out there. The one I use is called Kajabi, where I upload my videos, I upload my lessons. It's set up so that students can log in. They have their own password. I don't have to figure out how to code any of this. Even setting up my website, right? Like I just use Squarespace, and it's just like a click and drop basically system, right?
Yeah.
So easy, and it looks amazing, and it's user friendly. And hearing stories even from, like I said, like 10 15 years ago of all the coding that had to get put in to be able to do these things, and I can do it instantly and reach people around the world. And so the ease of that has helped so much. We're now moving to a lot more kind of automation in terms of our team. I have a few virtual assistants that work with me. I have a clinical assistant here. And so we're moving away from my old system of having sticky notes all over the place and kind of passing them pieces of paper that wasn't very efficient, to using a lot of, content management programs, productivity management. We use a program called Asana for example, which is a project management tool where, we can put in every new project that we have to work on and who's assigned to what task and when it's due, and we can update each other in that. And it's just so wonderful to have, especially when you're having teams that are working partly from home or working virtually, and to be able to stay on track. And it's just, be able to communicate in a way that we couldn't before.
I like that. So what was it called? Kajabi? How do you spell that?
Kajabi is the online course platform that I use. It's Kagabi. And then Asana is the project management tool, Asana. And so there's I don't think there's a free version of Kajabi, but there's a free version of Asana, I know. So anyone can start using it if you want to kind of set up some more streamlined systems for keeping track of what's on your to-do list. And what I really like about it is you can set up little mini projects. So for example, when I see a client, there are a lot of tasks that I have to do for every client. And so I can copy that project, duplicate it for this new client, and then it sets new deadlines for me so that I'm not missing any of the steps with each of these projects, which is super helpful for me and my team.
Those are that's the productivity tools, right? Just that. And that, let's go back to your podcast or I can just hear you saying, and for me personally, I'm using Kajabi to do an online course, or I'm using this Asana. I mean, I love that. And then the Wix, I used Wix to do my website, and then I went to a website, because you can go to the next level. And I don't know the name of it, but there's several companies who do when they're onboarding. So if they come to your website and it funnels you to, to log in, if you're so the front, whatever you see, if you're a member or part of if you're logged in and registered, you get the front page or landing page than someone who's not.
Right.
And the database management, which is the big thing, which people say, I got to get a Weber or the programmer to do that. Again, you can get the data management. That's probably the most expensive part. When the guy, I watched his video, it was like 15 minutes, and he showed how he created these 4 parts: members. It was called the workplace or workspace, whatever it was. It was, where you have these people. You have this group of people, and it's like those 4 segments. So your website, which you mentioned, and then you had this database and that landing page, and I think there was a 4th thing, but it was like all so seamless. He goes, for about $200-300 a month. I'm like, whoa. People are talking about $500-600 a month just for a web page, right? Or whatever it is, So yeah, and this is a do-it-yourselfer, and the guy's like, I would do it cheaper. It took me 20 hours to set this up. Took me 28. It would probably only take 20 hours because of that, whatever it was, right? And I'm like, but that's a really not complicated, but it's kind of four corners. And that, I think that helps people, right? If they know that helps them. I can do this quickly. I don't know who, husband, wife, man, daughter, son, brother, uncle, Uncle Larry, who just can't get a job. You know what I mean? Like these tools are out there. Okay.
That's right. Yeah.
So what the mental health space, do you get into that? I know it's not like your practice, but is it some of that stuff you're doing on podcasting? Is it get into mental health?
A little bit, not severe mental health. It's more focused on kind of mental wellness more than, mental illness, right? That aspect of mental health. So, how do we keep ourselves from burning out as busy professionals and parents and dealing with all of the things? How do we recognize? I talk a lot about a process that's the psychology term for it's called somatization, but it's basically when our bodies are showing physical signs of stress, things like tension headaches and muscle tension and stomach problems that we all have from time to time. And, how do we recognize that our bodies are giving us signs that we're hitting our limits, right? We're taking on too much and we're trying to do too much and we need to take a break. So we definitely spend some time focusing on, how do we recognize these signs? What do we do about it once we notice that we're in this point of burnout or exhaustion, and kind of how can we get back some of those mental resources to succeed?
If you ever want to collab, I love this because there's people that, where there's resources, people ask these things all the time. How do you get motivated? How do you do this? And literally what you just said, there's probably tools, but even just talking about it sounds like sometimes just talking about it would help people.
Absolutely. Even just that understanding, right? And I think that's what a lot of us is we feel so often like we're in this alone, or we're the only person to have ever experienced these things. And it's not true. There are 7 billion people on the planet, right? Other people have experienced this before. And so even just that understanding of, oh, this is normal for my body and my brain to be doing this. Okay, now I know what to do about it.
Just wanted to talk about that because the amount of funding, I going back to that VC, venture capital funding that I look at, there's the startups at least once every other day, say 2-3 times a week, I see some new company. And there's a couple named this I Feel online therapy, a 4-year, so it's in Spain, online therapy startup that's available to individuals through a subscription, but it's the employees helping employees manage the working from home, right? Or Rhythm, company called Rhythm Mental and Social Health or Social Wellbeing. And, they're in Texas, in Dallas, and mental health and social emotional well-being. So helping people in the work. A lot of these that I've seen are focused around the workplace.
Yeah.
But that's stress, but also, people working from home in a stressful situation previously, pre-COVID. Do you get families to talk? Do you coaching that kind of stuff? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. Work is stressful. I'm not surprised at all that there are lots of resources being developed for use in the workplace. We spend so much time at work, right? It's such an important component of our lives. And that's been a really tough transition, I think, for a lot of folks over the past 18 months is blurring of that divide, right? Now work is at home. We're working from home, at least partly, and our family's there, and we don't have that, mental space anymore. And our brains really like to have things compartmentalize. Our brains really like routine. They like doing work at work and home at home. And when things start to blur, it's really tough for us and it drains a lot of our resources, right? And then we end up, working until midnight because we work at home anyway, and we might as well keep working. And that's a tough pattern to break. And I think it's going to be something as well. It's going to be another adjustment over the next few months as we all start moving back to working in the office and getting out of those habits that we've gotten into working at home where those lines have really been blurred.
They do some funny commercials where they do have, the work. I think Peloton does a commercial where they show each of the room and people using Peloton, but that mental health space, you get people needing quiet time. Or, even if I listened to, a podcast the other day and they're talking about the work, a lot of New York and San Francisco where the occupancies in the office space is still down. That means if they're not at the office, they're still at home. And so, that a lot of your, I guess maybe you're not seeing it for those kind of clients, but are you seeing it out there? And I guess your colleagues on that, the psychology clients, that there's still people at home and that stresses are still there?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of folks are still working from home, or at least working from home part-time, or they're, anticipating working from home again in the future as, we go into further waves and things aren't going away.
Yeah, the flip-flopping and where we should be.
Yeah. So. Yeah. Which is really tough. And especially for families, like you mentioned, as kids are going back to school and there's a lot of uncertainty of, are they going to stay at school, or are we going to end up teaching from home again? Am I going to have to stay home with them and teach them? And that's a lot of, even if we haven't gotten to that point yet, because we've had to deal with this over the past year, our brains are thinking about these things, right? Like, what if this happens? And what if this happens? Yeah.
That's that anxiety, dealing with it. And your podcast must be, it must be blowing up. I'm telling you, but you're in a space which is very, very important. Just driving and people here, or they're at home and, and wanting that mindfulness. Do you talk about mindfulness or the chakras, things like, I know I'm going off topic a bit, but is that relevant?
It is. It's not a specialty focus of mine. So I don't talk about it directly. We do talk about some kind of mindfulness and relaxation based techniques, but I focus a lot on, because my background is in learning and memory. And so my focus a lot is, what are we training our brains, right? So right now, if I'm sitting here and stressing and thinking about all these what ifs, I'm training my brain that what I do is I sit here and freak out and worry and think about all these things. And so how do we interrupt that pattern in our brains? How do we snap our brain out of that worry mode so that I'm not sitting here and stressing about all these things, and kind of how can we interrupt that pathway for our brain? So similar types of ideas, but just from a little bit of a different perspective because of my background.
No, but I love it. So let's go back to your own personal point. 6 weeks, you said 6 weeks. And what did you do? Your brain, instead of worrying, you started switching on some ideas on how to, find other avenues of revenue or activities, right? To me, that sounds like a wonderful thing. Look, instead of stressing about that, I guess you need to probe and ask your clients, what do you like? Sewing or hockey or, or baseball, or, can you find write a book or an article on thing? I don't know, like that. I think there's a good lesson in what you just said to help, but you need to know. I guess you need to know what people, I guess to probe and talk a little bit as a consultant, as it were. But find that, how do you go from the worry of the buildup to, oh, I can run a podcast, or I can do a blog, or I can use Kajabi to do my online course, which I always wanted to do as a, you know what I mean? Like that. I think that works for a lot of people, or could work for a lot of people.
I think so too. I think it's a great strategy. And it really comes back to, what can we control? I can't control everything that's going on around me, but I can control where I let my thoughts go. So do I let them think about all the ways things could get worse, or all the stuff that I can't deal with right now? Or can I direct that to something that I can control, whether that's a hobby, or focusing on my family, or focusing on my health, or kind of what can I control right now? And that's a great way to relieve anxiety and stress for our brains.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Nicole, I want to ask you what the future is, and where, what do you think is key for your clients, and what do you think is key for your business going forward?
I think one thing that I'm focusing on going forward, I know I talked about this a little bit already, but keeping in mind, how can we do things differently? And I feel like something I've learned a lot, and a lot of us have over the past couple of years, is things can change, right? We always say the unexpected can happen, but none of us knew we were going to be in a global pandemic for 18 months, and the world would shut down. And so how can we keep in mind, where can I pivot? Where can I try things differently to, like you said, really get at what people's needs are at the time? And I think something that's going to become more and more important as we go forward here is finding connection. And we've been so isolated for the past year and a half. And, that's something that a lot of folks are struggling with, is missing that connection and being around other people. And how, maybe if we can't do that in person, are there other ways that we can use some of this technology, like you said, that's available to us to form those connections and form those supports and get our brains out of this, doom and gloom type view and towards a more positive view of our future. So that's kind of where I'm thinking with my business, is how can we foster this connection? How can we help people feel a greater sense of control in a world that's a lot of the times out of our control?
No, that's right. To pivot, it's a pivot in your mind. Wow. I don't know. I think there's a lot to unpack, but I think there's a lot that I can take away from this. But how do people find you? Because I know I found you on LinkedIn, and there was a 60.
That's okay. Yeah.
But
not the best place. Yeah. Don't look for me on LinkedIn. Well, you can, but there'll be limited information there. Yeah. The best place is probably my one website. It's just drnicolebyers.com. That's where I have links to my blogs, to my podcast, to my courses. I do have a website for my clinical practice, Rocky Mountain Neurosciences, but it also links back to this other website, because more of my resources that are available for, folks out there are on that second website, drnicolebyers.com.
And then there's your podcast, The Bold Life.
Yeah. So there's links to that as well. Any podcast platform, you can listen to it. I have some free resources on that website to help with mindset and productivity and decision-making. And so you can snag all those there too.
Well, Dr. Byers, Nicole, this has been fantastic. And Rocky Mountain Neuroscience, it is a mouthful, but I think, wow, there's a lot I don't know what to take away from this. And I have no one thing, but thank you for, and Henry, thank you for sharing Henry's story. Because
you're welcome.
That's brilliant. So I hope you have a great evening and stay safe.
You as well. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.